Jake Carter never imagined his life would come to this, scraping by on odd jobs, trying to keep food on the table for his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. Every morning he woke up with one thought: make it through the day. So when he stumbled upon a flyer offering cash for barn repairs, he didn't hesitate. The job led him to a quiet, unassuming farm on the outskirts of town, where an independent yet weary woman named Emily Harper needed help fixing up an old, crumbling barn. She didn't say much, just pointed to the broken beams and handed him a toolbox. He didn't ask questions. He needed the work and she needed the help. But what Jake didn't know was that Emily was no ordinary farmer, and this wasn't just a simple repair job. Beneath her dust-covered jeans and calloused hands lay a secret legacy of thousands of acres of untouched farmland, wealth beyond imagination, and a past she wasn't ready to share. As their worlds quietly intertwined, one bound by struggle, the other by hidden fortune. Neither of them realized that this barn was just the beginning of something much greater, something that could change both their lives forever. Jake Carter woke up before dawn, just as he did every morning. The small apartment was silent except for the soft breathing of his 7-year-old daughter Lily, curled up beneath a threadbare blanket. He took a moment to watch her, the faint glow from the street lamp outside casting soft shadows on her face. She was his entire world, the only thing that kept him going when everything else in his life seemed to crumble. He moved quietly, careful not to wake her as he pulled on his worn-out jeans and the same flannel shirt he had been wearing for years. Money was tight, tighter than he ever thought possible. Every dollar was stretched to its limit, and still it never seemed to be enough. He worked whatever jobs he could find: construction, hauling junk, fixing up old houses. Some days were better than others, but lately, the bad days had outnumbered the good ones. As he poured the last bit of coffee from a nearly empty can into his cup, he stared at the stack of overdue bills on the counter. Rent was late. The electric bill had a red warning stamp on it. The fridge was nearly empty, save for a half-martin of milk and some leftover pasta from 2 nights ago. The weight of it all sat heavy on his chest, but he had no choice but to push forward. He had to keep going. For Lily. His phone buzzed with a message from an old buddy who knew he was looking for work. Barn repairs needed. Pays cash. Call this number. Jake sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. He didn't know much about barns, but he knew how to fix things. If it meant keeping the lights on for another month, he'd figure it out. After scribbling a quick note for Lily and setting out a bowl of cereal for when she woke up, he grabbed his tool bag and headed out. The morning air was crisp, the kind that cut through his thin jacket as he walked to his old pickup truck, which groaned in protest when he turned the key. He muttered a silent prayer that it would last a little longer. Repairs weren't in the budget, and a breakdown could mean losing work he couldn't afford to lose. The drive took him out of town, past rows of empty fields and quiet country roads. He followed the directions until he arrived at a modest-looking farm. The house was simple, with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. Off to the side stood a barn, its roof sagging slightly, one door hanging off its hinges. It was clear this place had been through years of wear and tear. A woman was waiting for him, her arms crossed over a faded denim jacket. She looked tough, but there was a quiet tiredness in her eyes, something he recognized all too well. "You must be Jake," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "That's me," he replied, shifting the tool bag on his shoulder. "Got a message about a barn that needs some work." She nodded, leading him toward the structure without another word. As they walked, he took in the surroundings. The land stretched farther than he had expected, rolling hills in the distance, rows of fencing that disappeared into the horizon. It felt bigger than it looked from the road. Inside the barn, the damage was obvious. Rotting beams, holes in the walls where the wind had worn it down over time. It was a mess, but fixable. "How bad does it look?" she asked, watching him carefully. Jake ran a hand over one of the beams, testing its strength. "Gonna take some work. Wood's rotted in places, the roof's barely holding on. Could be a few weeks' worth of repairs, maybe more, depending on what you're looking to do." She hesitated, as if weighing her options. "How soon can you start?" "Today, if you want." She studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "All right. Cash at the end of each day. I'll be around if you need anything." With that, she walked off, leaving him alone in the barn. Jake exhaled, rolling up his sleeves. He had no idea who this woman was, or why she was trying to fix up a place that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the paycheck waiting for him at the end of the day. He got to work, pulling down broken boards, measuring out new support beams, hammering nails into place. The hours passed quickly, the physical labor a welcome distraction from everything weighing on his mind. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, blending with the distant rustling of trees and the occasional call of a bird overhead. By midday he wiped the sweat from his forehead and took a break, leaning against the barn door. He spotted the woman, Emily, he had learned, standing near the fence line staring out at the fields. There was something about the way she stood, hands in her pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, that reminded him of himself, like she was carrying something heavy that no one else could see. She turned and caught him watching, raising an eyebrow. "Making progress?" "Yeah," he said, lifting his water bottle. "Gonna take some time, but I'll get it done." She nodded, but didn't say anything else. Jake wasn't the type to pry, but something about this whole situation felt different. Most people who hired him for work either hovered over his shoulder or barely acknowledged him at all. Emily was somewhere in between. Watching, but from a distance, like she was trying to decide whether or not to trust him. As the afternoon stretched on, he thought about Lily back home, probably playing with her worn-out stuffed rabbit, waiting for him to come back with dinner. He had promised her things would get better, but promises felt empty when they were backed by nothing but hope. When the sun started to dip below the trees, Emily walked over and handed him an envelope. "For today," she said simply. Jake took it, feeling the weight of cash inside. He nodded. "Thanks." She hesitated for a second. "You coming back tomorrow?" "As long as you need the work done," he replied. Something flickered in her expression. Relief, maybe, or something close to it. Then she gave a small nod and walked off again. Jake climbed into his truck, the engine sputtering to life as he pulled away. The envelope sat on the passenger seat, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sliver of relief. One more day of work meant one more day of keeping the lights on, one more meal for Lily, one more step toward keeping the world from falling apart. He had no idea that this simple job would lead to something much bigger, something that would change everything. But for now, all he could do was take it one day at a time. Jake drove down the winding road back toward town, gripping the steering wheel as the sun cast long shadows across the fields. The envelope sat beside him, its contents enough to keep food on the table for a little while longer. As the truck rattled over a pothole, he exhaled, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He had no idea how long this job would last, but at least for now, it was something to hold on to. Back at the farm, Emily watched the dust settle from Jake's departure. The old barn, weathered and worn, was finally seeing some life again, though the same couldn't be said for the rest of the place. The once thriving land had grown quieter over the years, empty fields stretching endlessly, waiting for someone to bring them back to what they once were. She adjusted the sleeves of her jacket, fingers tracing the frayed edges. Hiring Jake had been a last-minute decision, one she hadn't entirely thought through. She didn't know him, didn't know if he was the kind of man who would stick around long enough to finish what he'd started, but something about the way he worked, steady, determined, told her she had made the right call. Walking toward the house, she glanced up at the porch light flickering against the evening sky. The place had been in her family for generations, passed down through hard work and sacrifice. To anyone looking in from the outside, it appeared simple, almost forgotten. But beyond the peeling paint and creaking floorboards lay something far greater than most could see. Inside, she set her hat on the kitchen table, glancing at the stack of letters beside it. More offers, more inquiries, more people wanting a piece of something they didn't understand. She ignored them, just as she always did. Letting go of what had been built here wasn't an option, not now, not ever. She moved to the sink, filling a glass with water, staring out the window as the wind rustled through the trees. The silence of the evening wrapped around her, familiar yet distant. It had been years since the place had been full of voices, laughter, the sounds of life moving forward. Now it was just her, the land, and the weight of everything left behind. The next morning she rose before the first light, pulling on boots worn from years of walking the same paths. The air carried the scent of damp earth, the sky still streaked with the last remnants of night. She stepped outside, the world around her just beginning to stir. A few hours later, Jake's truck rolled up the drive, kicking up dust as it came to a stop near the barn. He climbed out, toolbox in hand, nodding in her direction before heading straight to work. Emily watched as Jake moved with quiet efficiency, already setting up for another long day. She hadn't given him much instruction, yet he seemed to understand exactly what needed to be done. Tools clanked against wood, the rhythmic pounding of nails filling the morning stillness. She leaned against the porch railing, sipping coffee gone lukewarm, observing the way he worked without hesitation. His focus never wavered, as if each motion carried a deeper purpose. She had seen plenty of laborers come and go over the years. Men looking for quick cash, uninterested in anything beyond the immediate task. Jake was different. He didn't ask questions, didn't waste time, didn't treat the job as if it were beneath him. That alone made her trust him more than most. Midday arrived, the sun climbing high overhead, casting sharp angles across the landscape. Emily made her way toward the barn, stopping just inside the entrance. Jake stood near a pile of salvaged wood, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "You've done a lot already," she remarked, noting the fresh boards reinforcing the walls, the steady progress that had taken shape in just a short time. He nodded, reaching for his water bottle. "Still a long way to go." She hesitated before pulling an extra bottle from her pocket, tossing it in his direction. He caught it without effort, cracking the cap open with a quiet thanks. Silence settled between them, neither in a rush to fill it. Emily had grown accustomed to solitude, to conversations that felt unnecessary, but there was something different about Jake's presence. Uncomplicated, unforced. "You been doing this kind of work long?" she asked finally. "Fixing things? Yeah, started young. Didn't really have a choice." She understood that tone, recognized the weight beneath his words. Life didn't always wait for people to be ready, it simply demanded, and you either rose to meet it or got left behind. A breeze swept through the open doors, rustling the dust in golden streaks. The barn, old as it was, had seen years of storms, hands shaping it over time, each board carrying a story. Jake ran his fingers over one of the beams, feeling the grain beneath his palm. "This place has been here a while," he noted. Emily nodded. "Built by my grandfather. My dad kept it standing. Now it's up to me." He glanced at her, something unreadable passing through his expression. "Not many stick around for that kind of thing anymore." She shrugged, kicking at the dirt with the toe of her boot. "Guess I'm not like most." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, barely there before disappearing. He didn't push for more, didn't pry into things she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he turned back to his work, as if understanding that some things weren't meant to be spoken aloud. Hours stretched on, shadows growing longer as the day inched toward evening. The weight of unspoken truths lingered between them, not heavy, but present. Neither sought to bridge the distance with unnecessary words. Instead, they continued as they were, two people bound by work, by quiet understanding, by something neither could quite name yet. As the sun dipped lower, the golden light filtering through the barn's wooden slats cast long, shifting shadows across the dirt floor. Jake continued working, his hands moving with practiced precision, driving nails into fresh beams, reinforcing the foundation of something that had once stood strong but had slowly given way to time. Every motion was deliberate, every swing of the hammer a quiet testament to his resilience. He had spent his life piecing things back together. Houses, fences, furniture, but rarely had he ever had the chance to restore something that truly mattered. Emily lingered by the entrance, her arms loosely crossed, eyes tracing the careful progress he had made. The transformation was subtle but undeniable, evidence of steady effort from someone who understood the value of craftsmanship. There was no rushing, no cutting corners, just an unspoken commitment to doing things right. She hadn't expected that when she first hired him. People came and went, eager to earn a day's pay, but unwilling to invest themselves in anything deeper. The contrast between them became more apparent with every passing day. Emily had spent years in quiet isolation, tending to the land with a determination that kept most people at a distance. She had never minded the solitude. In fact, she preferred it. The farm was her responsibility, a burden she had carried alone for longer than she cared to admit. Jake, on the other hand, moved through life with the weight of someone who had fought against forces unseen. He never spoke of the struggles he endured, but Emily could see them written in the lines of his face, in the way his shoulders tensed ever so slightly when he thought no one was looking. As dusk settled over the land, she finally broke the silence between them. "You work like someone who doesn't know how to stop." Jake paused, setting his tools aside before wiping the sweat from his brow. "Stopping doesn't pay the bills." She considered that for a moment, understanding it far too well. For as long as she could remember, her days had been dictated by the demands of the land. Rest had never been an option. There was always something to be done, always another task waiting. "I used to think like that," she admitted, leaning against a nearby post. "That if I just kept going, kept pushing, things would fall into place." Jake met her gaze, something flickering beneath the surface of his otherwise unreadable expression. "And did they?" A small, bitter smile played at the corner of her lips. "Not exactly." The barn fell into quiet again, the sounds of the evening settling in around them. Crickets hummed in the fields, the faint rustling of the wind weaving through the trees. It was a familiar kind of silence, the kind that came when words felt too heavy to carry. Jake finally stood, stretching the stiffness from his back before glancing toward the farmhouse. "You ever think about leaving?" Emily let out a soft breath, shaking her head. "This place is all I've ever known." He studied her for a moment before nodding. There was no judgment in his eyes, no disbelief, just understanding. He knew what it meant to hold on to something even when everything else told you to let go. The air between them shifted, an unspoken recognition settling between them. They were different in so many ways, yet somehow they carried the same burdens, wore the same invisible scars. Neither had planned for their paths to cross, but now that they had, neither could deny the quiet pull of recognition in the other. Jake gathered his tools, placing them carefully into his worn-out bag, the weight familiar in his grip. The evening breeze carried the scent of earth and timber, wrapping around him as he stepped out of the barn. Emily remained by the entrance, her posture relaxed but her expression distant, as though she were lost somewhere deep within her own thoughts. The farm stretched beyond them, quiet under the fading light, the land vast and unassuming to an outsider's eyes. He had never asked about the farm's history, nor had she volunteered any details. But standing there, watching her gaze drift over the open fields, he sensed there was more beneath the surface than she let on. He had seen that kind of look before, the weight of something bigger than one person should carry alone. "Tomorrow I'll start on the east wall," he said finally, breaking the silence between them. Emily nodded, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "Good." Something in her voice wavered, so slight that most wouldn't have noticed. Jake did. He knew what it meant when people kept things close, holding back words they weren't sure they wanted to say aloud. It wasn't hesitation, it was protection. He hesitated for just a breath before speaking again. "This place yours?" The question lingered between them, heavier than the night air. Emily didn't answer right away, her fingers tracing the edge of her sleeve as if considering how much she wanted to reveal. "It was my father's," she said at last. "And his before that." Jake nodded, unsurprised. Places like this didn't end up in the hands of just anyone. They were built through generations, passed down like heirlooms, holding stories within every fence post and broken beam. "Must have taken a lot to keep it going," he said, though he already knew the answer. Her mouth twitched, something between amusement and exhaustion flashing across her face. "More than most people realize." Jake leaned against the barn, arms crossed loosely over his chest. "Then why fix it up now?" Emily's eyes flickered toward him, sharp yet guarded. He had overstepped, and they both knew it, but instead of brushing him off, she exhaled, the tension in her shoulders loosening just enough for honesty to slip through. "Because it deserves better than to be forgotten." Jake understood that in a way few might. He had spent most of his life watching things slip through his fingers, opportunities, stability, the kind of security that others seemed to take for granted. Some things couldn't be saved. Some things weren't meant to last, but when you found something worth holding on to, you fought for it. Emily turned away, her gaze drifting over the land once more. The weight of her words hung between them, unspoken but understood. Jake glanced back at the barn, at the work still left to be done. The job had started as just another paycheck, a way to keep going a little longer. But standing there, seeing the way she looked at this place, he realized it was becoming something else entirely. Jake stood in the fading light, his fingers absent-mindedly running along the rough grain of the barn's new boards. The evening had settled into a comfortable stillness, the air carrying the distant hum of crickets and the rustling of wind through tall grass. Emily remained quiet beside him, her arms loosely crossed, her expression unreadable. He could tell she was lost in thought, though she hid it well beneath the steady composure she always seemed to wear. He hadn't expected to find himself invested in this place, but something about it had begun to settle into him. The work was hard, the hours long, yet each nail driven into the worn structure felt less like just another task and more like stitching together something that had been waiting for a second chance. He had spent most of his life fixing things that weren't his, yet this was different. "You ever think about what comes next?" Jake asked, his voice breaking the quiet between them. Emily turned slightly, her gaze lingering on the field stretching far beyond the barn. "Next?" "Yeah, once this is done." He gestured toward the structure they had both poured so much into. "What happens after?" She let out a slow breath, the kind that carried more weight than she probably intended to show. "Haven't really thought that far." Jake studied her for a moment, noting the way her jaw tightened just slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether to admit the truth. He had seen that look before, in himself more times than he. Planning too far ahead had never been a luxury he could afford, and it seemed she understood that all too well. "Maybe you should," he said, keeping his voice even. "You put all this work into something, gotta have a reason." Emily's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Maybe the reason is enough." Jake nodded, letting the thought settle between them. He could understand that, in a way most wouldn't. Sometimes the purpose of a thing wasn't about the outcome, it was about the act itself, about proving something to yourself, even if no one else would ever see it. A breeze rolled through, carrying the scent of earth and wood, stirring the dust near their feet. He shifted, rolling his shoulders to ease the ache that had settled deep from the long hours. Emily caught the motion, tilting her head slightly. "You do this kind of work forever?" He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Feels like it." She studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind her gaze. "What would you do if you could choose?" Jake frowned slightly, the question catching him off guard. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him that, maybe no one ever had. He opened his mouth, then hesitated, realizing he didn't have an answer. "Guess I never really thought about it." Emily nodded as if she had expected that. "Maybe you should," Jake smirked, shaking his head. "Stealing my own words against me now?" For the first time, Emily actually smiled, the expression small but genuine. "Maybe." The night deepened around them, the stars beginning to scatter across the dark expanse overhead. The silence between them was no longer heavy, no longer filled with things unspoken. It was something else entirely. Something neither of them quite had a name for yet. The days stretched into weeks, the barn slowly transforming from a forgotten relic into something sturdy, something that stood proud against the open sky. Jake had poured his effort into every beam, every nail, every careful repair, but somewhere along the way the work had become more than just another job. It had become something that grounded him, something that made him feel a part of something real for the first time in a long while. Emily saw it too, in the way he never rushed through a task, in the quiet patience he showed when fixing even the smallest details. He was more than just a worker passing through. He belonged here in a way neither of them had expected. One evening, as the final touches on the barn came together, they stood side by side, looking up at what they had rebuilt. The last rays of sunlight bathed the wood in gold, the air filled with the rich scent of earth and fresh lumber. It was done. But instead of relief, Jake felt something else. Something that told him he wasn't ready to walk away. Emily turned to him, her expression softer than usual. "It's good work," she said, her voice carrying something more than just gratitude. He nodded, taking in the sight before them. "Yeah, it is." A quiet settled between them, but this time it wasn't something to fill, it was something to hold. "So?" she said after a long moment, her gaze meeting his, uncertainty flickering there. What comes next? Jake exhaled, rolling the thought over in his mind. For once he had an answer. Maybe I stick around, he said, his voice steady. If that's something you'd want. Emily didn't speak right away. Instead, she simply looked at him, really looked at him, as if trying to decide if this was real. Then, slowly, she smiled. I think I'd like that. And just like that, everything changed. Not in some grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet, steady way that things do when they're meant to. Jake had come here looking for work. He had found something else entirely, a home, a place to belong, and, perhaps most unexpectedly, someone who made staying feel like the easiest decision he had ever made.